This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
Okay, hello. How's everyone? Did everybody manage to find the caretaker somewhere? I hope. And several of you have asked me to make sure I indicate where you can see these plays if you want to take a look. I'm a sort of purist in the sense that I always think read it before you see it, because I want your imagination to respond to what's on the page rather than being told how to see it through someone else's point of view. However, there is, I did indicate that to Alfredo, so I hope those of you who wanted it got it. There's an original film, which is basically the stage play Cracked Open from 1973, of The Caretaker with Donald Pleasance and Robert Shaw and Alan Bates. So maybe some of you actually went on YouTube. You can see them free. And for next week, which is the homecoming, there is also a film. Again, just go on YouTube. You don't have to pay for it. It's the original film made by Peter Hall, the director Peter Hall, right after the homecoming was done. And that one is interesting because it stars Vivian Merchant, who was Pinter's wife, first wife. And I think you may remember that I told you the first week that Pinter fell in love with Vivian Merchant when she was the lead actress in his rep company in Ireland. He was a nobody, and she was the lead actress, and he married her. It was such a scandal in a registry office on Yom Kippur, and she isn't Jewish. And his family was devastated and refused to either acknowledge that he'd married her or come to the ceremony or really acknowledge her after the fact. So when we read The Homecoming next week, you will recognize that the story of a man who's married a non-Jewish woman and finally brings her home was really Pinter's own, and that's Vivian Merchant. So if you see The Homecoming next week, take a look at her. She was an incredible actress. She was his muse. However, she hated The Caretaker. And this is germane for, I'm just going to give you a little background on The Caretaker before we talk about it as a play. So you will remember that The Birthday Party, which we read last week, was an epic flop, right? Remember I told you it got like the worst reviews ever until Harold Hobson came along on the Thursday of its 1 week run. And by the Sunday Times, the day it was closing, this review came out saying this is a seminal piece of theater that people will remember in hundreds of years, which turned out to be true, but it didn't help the play. So the play closed. The Caretaker, surprisingly, opened on April 27th, 1960, and it was a huge hit. And when you go back and read it, I'm so curious, and as always, please feel free to put questions in the chat, because I'm curious what you had to say, think what you thought about it. I think it's a very difficult play. And I actually, in many ways, I feel that The Birthday Party is a more successful play, partly because I think The Birthday Party has more humanity and is funnier. I think the racism of the character of Davies, while intentional, it's exactly what Pinter was writing about, is so disturbing to read right now that I'm not sure I feel like I would be compelled as a theater artist at this moment to do The Caretaker. Having said that, it's a really important play in his canon. So I wanted to sort of tell you what inspired it. In the 60s, in the early 60s, Pinter still had no money. He was in his 30s. He was still trying to live as an actor, but, not getting great roles and living kind of hand to mouth. And he and Vivian were living in a first floor flat in Chiswick in London, a kind of depressing place. And he had this baby. He'd had Daniel 6 months before. So Daniel, was crawling around at his feet while he was writing The Caretaker. And as Pinter described, there was a chap who owned the house, said Pinter, a builder, like Mick in The Caretaker, who had his own van. And remember, I told you this thing about be wary in Pinter of people who have big cars or vans because they're going to take you away. That comes up a lot in Pinter. It sounds peculiar now, but in the early 60s in England, most people didn't own their own car. Right. It was very unusual that you had if you were poor, you just took the bus or the tube. You didn't have your own car. So someone who has his own van, particularly not just a car, but a big thing that you could cart people away, that was a kind of sign of danger and power. When we get to the room, you're going to see that Bert, the silent, violent husband, he drives a white van, and you sort of think, be wary of the man in the van. Anyway, there was a man living there, had his own van, and he was never there. They never saw the man who kept up the place. But the guy's brother lived in the house, and he was sort of a handyman, but he was very introverted and very secretive and very sad. And it turned out his name was Austin, which is obviously where the character comes from in The Caretaker. And it turned out he'd been in a mental hospital and had electroshock therapy. So you may remember, either way back in your own lives or in literature you've read, that in that period, in the 60s, in the 50s, really, and 60s, and even in the late 40s, this happened, of course, to Tennessee Williams' sister, Rose. So you may have read about this, but Rose had a lot of mental illness and was given shock therapy and was never the same again. And Tennessee Williams could never forgive himself that he allowed this to happen to his precious and beautiful sister. And he, in a sense, wrote Rose his whole life. You know, Blanche in Streetcar is really his homage to his sister, and things like that. Laura in Glass Menagerie is also a bit of Rose. So this was Austin, who'd had electroshock therapy. And I want to say tangentially, because some of you I don't know if you know about the famous British psychologist of the 60s called R.D. Laing, Laing. I don't know if this name rings a bell to you, but he was an incredibly important psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. And his theory about mental illness was that it is the world that is abnormal, not the patient. And I think that had an enormous influence on Pinter. So I think for Pinter, looking at this man who'd had this treatment, he thought about characters like Stanley. So cast your mind back to last week when we worked on Stanley in The Homecoming, right? I mean, in The Birthday Party. You sort of wonder, what is Stanley's crime? Why has he been interrogated? Why are these men coming to get him? And in some way, it feels like his crime is being an artist, being a maverick, being someone who doesn't color inside the lines, who has ways of living or opinions or whatever that are different, and therefore gets, in a sense, castrated by the culture. Because, you know, what Pinter felt about post-war British culture is it was so bureaucratic and so schematized that you didn't belong if you weren't a certain kind of person following a certain, sort of a certain kind of path in your life. We don't know this or why Stanley gets damaged, but we watch in The Birthday Party, we watch his mind get broken. So this is another character who has undergone a kind of mental breaking and is now trying to live his life. And Pinter found that incredibly moving. And the description he writes of the place he lived in Chiswick was that one day this brother, Austin, brought a tramp home, and he stayed 3 or 4 weeks. Pinter and Vivian lived on the ground floor, and they were upstairs, and he would see this tramp coming down the stairs in filthy old clothes and muttering to himself, and he wondered what he was doing there, and he empathized with him. Pinter was always felt like he was an inch away from vagrancy himself. So he had a kind of feeling for homelessness, in a sense, and for that kind of character. Anyway, one day he saw an image. He walked upstairs and the door was open, and he saw an image of this tramp rooting around in his bag, and the brother with his back to the door looking out the window. And Pinter never forgot that image, and that's where he started the play. And that's the image that The Caretaker ends on, right? With this brother looking out the window at the landscape and the tramp rooting in the bag. Vivian, the wife, felt she detested the play because she felt that Pinter had betrayed this man in writing, creating a character out of him. And of course, be wary of falling in love with the writer, because your life is going to get appropriated every time, and you will always end up right smack dab in the center of whatever it is. That's how it goes. But she felt very upset about it. So the Caretaker is a play about brothers, right? Sort of a filial relationship, and and an old man. And so in broad strokes, one has to wonder, what is it? What is it about? Why these relationships, and what was Pinter trying to talk about? Now, there is a theme that's going to come up for us in this whole class. You're going to hear it a lot in Pinter, between fathers and sons. It's partly a kind of ancient Hebraic thing almost, which is like in the Old Testament, what does the father owe the son? Quite different from the New Testament and Jesus's own sense of leaving your family behind to become Christian. You know, in the Hebraic tradition, the relationship of a father and the son is always complicated, because it starts with Abraham being asked by God to sacrifice his son. And I think Pinter always thought about that. He really knew the Bible. And this question of the father's, in a sense, the sons needing to reject the father in order to claim their kingdom, is going to be very much like what happens in the Homecoming, right? When you have to have the patriarch, you know, a kind of forced out of the kingdom in order that the children can inherit. So you could think of it as the Davies as the kind of father figure in a way, with these two sons. But you could also look at Davies this way. This is a man who lost his identity in the war. And you remember I told you in the first class how profoundly important the war experience was for the young 15-year-old Harold Pinter. So think about this. Davies keeps saying, I've got to get to Sidcup to get my papers, over and over and over again. And you think, what is he talking about? Well, first of all, it's quite interesting. Sidcup, the town, which is west of London, was the headquarters of the Royal Artillery. So it was the place that you went to get permission or to get your records if you had been in the army and you needed, once you got back into civilian life, documentation of your time in the service. So it's not completely mad. It's a funny word, Sidcup. He loved words with K's, by the way, Pinter. He loved that sound. So you'll notice he makes his characters names like Dokes, and he just likes that sound. So Sidcup, he thinks is a funny word, but it's also this place where you had to go. So somehow Davies, we think, is he a wandering Jew? Is he an immigrant? Is he a refugee? Why has he lost his identity? Where are his papers? What happened to him during the war? Did his mind get blown? Did he actually go abroad? Has he just come back to England? What does he stand for? So he lives in this liminal place that was post-war England. But I also think he is a human being who is excluded in some way from the network of family relations, right? He is unable to comprehend the idea of sibling unity. So he makes a fatal mistake in the play. You will remember at the end of the play, he tries to drive a wedge, right, between Mick and Aston, and to say, to play them off each other. And in the end of the play, he fails because blood is thicker than water, and he doesn't succeed in driving them apart. But you wonder, what is it he's trying to cling to, and why is it that he walks into the play? He is so tactical, Davies, right? He's very brilliant on short-term tactics, but he's really weak on long-term strategy. He can't live his life. And he's sort of symbolically and realistically, he is crippled by the fact that he has no shoes. Now, have you read Waiting for Godot or seen Waiting for Godot? Many of you may know Godot. Godot starts with Gogo, with Estragon, sitting on a rock, shaking out this shoe in incredible pain and trying to squeeze the shoe back on. And the first thing he says is nothing to be done, because his shoes hurt, and without shoes, you can't get anywhere. So a lot of people think that this beginning, this moment in The Caretaker about the shoes, is Pinter's homage, in a sense, shall we say, to Godot. I don't don't know that that's true, because I don't think he knew Godot well enough. He'd seen it once, but I don't think he knew it well enough. But this thing about not having the shoes, and that the shoes are somehow your lifeline to transit, and without it, you're trapped. It's going to carry us all the way through the play. And after all, Davies has had a lifetime on the road. And so you almost think, is he lying that he won't say where he's from, or has he actually totally lost the thread of his own identity? So one of the most wonderful exchanges in the play, I find, is when Aston says to him early on in the play, "Where were you born?" And Davies looks at him darkly and says, "What do you mean?" It's such an amazing response. Why would you say that? In any other play, if you're asked where you're born, you say Washington, D.C. or whatever. What do you mean? Because sort of Davies realizes that even your place of birth can be weaponized, right? If you say the wrong thing, or if you have a different name. Now, do you remember I told you, because of the whole Jewish thing of passing and changing your name, that's going to come up over and over again in Pinter. So in this play, his public name is Bernard Jenkins, which is Welsh, and Jonathan Pryce just played the role, and he played it Welsh. But we don't know if he was Welsh or if he's just making it up. And his original name is Davies. So that's what he's so terrified about, is anybody going to find out? Now, what is Davies driven by? John Stokes, who's one of, I think, the best Pinter critics, wrote a very good book on Pinter. He wrote, quote, "Davies' refusal to concede to others the right to relocation that he demands for himself makes him, if not the first, then certainly the most authentic portrait of a contemporary racist in modern British drama." And that is true. And frankly, rereading the play now, I found it so shocking how blatant the racism in this play is. Now, here's the kind of historical context for this within England. You may know about from 1940, in 1948, 450 Jamaicans arrived in London on a ship called the Emperor Windrush. Do you know about the Windrush story? This is an amazing story. They were Jamaican. They were part of the Commonwealth, right? They were a colony of England. They thought of themselves as English. They had fealty to the Queen. They used English currency at home. They believed that when they got to England after the war, that this was going to be their salvation and their culture, and that they belonged. And they got there. No, Susan, great question. Was Pinter a racist? I want to say categorically not. But absolutely, he was commenting on racism. And I think it's so important that we understand that distinction, because I think today playwrights or writers are so scared to be considered racist that they won't write about it one way or another. So here's the context in which Pinter is dealing with this. The Windrush generation was this group of Jamaicans, and you must read about it. It's fascinating and heartbreaking. They get to London, and you remember I told you about the brown shirts and the raging anti-Semitism in England after the war. It was a period of white working class rage, because poor people in England felt they had sacrificed everything for Europe. They still had rationing. They had no light at night. They had no petrol. They didn't have cars. They lived in terrible circumstances. They're the ones who sacrificed to beat Hitler. And what did they get from it? So the anti-Semitism was virulent and violent after the war, and the racism was violent in a way that, and I don't mean to paint every white working class person in the South of America as a Trump lover or whatever, but we have to understand that one of the reasons that the white working class in this country is so prejudiced is this terror of being replaced. Like in Charlottesville, they marched, "The Jews will not replace us." And you think, the Jews will not replace you? What are you talking about? But this rage that somebody else, some conspiracy is coming in to take your right away. This is the thing that Davies epitomizes. Now, what happened is the Windrush generation went through profound disillusionment. If you've ever read the novelist Zadie Smith, and if you haven't, I highly recommend that you do. She's a British novelist I adore. West Indian father, white mother. She writes a lot about this generation. Anyway, they had a truly terrible, disillusioning time dealing with the grim social climate in Britain after the war that they believed was going to be welcoming to them. And it led to the 1958 Notting Hill riots, in which that whole population of Jamaicans rose up and said, we will not be treated this way by our own, basically, Commonwealth. We're part of this. We've sacrificed for it. We fought for you in the war. The Indians, by the way, and Pakistanis are going to have exactly the same problem, right? After the war, there's a huge migration of particularly Pakistanis, and poor British called them Pakis, and the corner stores, which were all run by Pakistanis, were called Paki shops. And you'll hear that coming up in British drama in Edward Bond and David Hare. It comes up over and over again. So again, the racism of people who felt that their country was being invaded by people who were unlike them was a state of mind that Pinter found particularly horrifying. And he felt really strongly that it needed to be written about and it needed to be exposed for what it was. So when Davies says that terrifying speech, which is going to come up later in Act 1 in the play, let me see if I can find it for you, where he talks about, they want an Englishman to pour their tea. That's what they want. That's what they're crying out for. It's that kind of sick essentialism that says, this is what an Englishman is. And I want you to remember this, because when we read No Man's Land, which is about two old English guys who fought in the war and you're not even sure if they knew each other or not, they have this fantasy about what England was like growing up in these villages where everybody sounds like Noel Coward and everybody dances on the village green. And one of them says to the other, all we have left is the English language. Can it be salvaged? That's the question. But you think, what English language? The English language in Britain, particularly, and certainly in America, has always been shaped and reshaped by immigration. That's how we speak, right? We borrow language from everywhere, and that's why English is such a supple language. And Pinter was fascinated by that. So, and really wanted to write about it. And that's what The Homecoming is based on. So when you think about when you look at the very beginning of the play, this description, you have this character, Mick. He's alone in the room. He's sitting on the bed. He's wearing a leather jacket. It's totally silent. And then he stands up and starts to stare at all the objects in the room. It's an amazing first moment of a play, because what it lets you do as the audience is do the same thing. You start to stare at this room of junk, massive amounts of junk, and none of the junk seems to cohere. There is a gas stove. So let's remember, this is a Jewish playwright who lost a lot of family in the Holocaust. So there's a gas stove. Davies keeps saying, is it plugged in? Am I going to get gas? And you think, oh my God, of course he thinks that. Then there's a Buddha, a statue of a Buddha. And you think, what is that doing there? What does that represent? And then there are wood planks that Aston maybe is going to make into a shed. And then there are these two iron beds hidden beneath, just a massive amount of stuff. And Mick looks at everything, and the minute he hears something, he slips out the door. So already, you remember we talked about in the birthday party, that magic trick of Meg popping her little head through the hutch in the kitchen and then disappearing? It's just like that. You see Mick, and then he disappears. And then Aston and Davies enter, and Davies is all worn out, and Aston is quite, he's in a pinstripe suit, single-breasted pullover, shirt and tie, so quite comme il faut, quite respectable in a way, with this tramp. And the first thing he says, so think about what we talked about in Pinter about one character never exists without another, that it's always relational, right? So the first thing Aston says is, sit down. In any other playwright, that would just be a throwaway. In Pinter, it's a command and it's a power play. What does Davies do? You would think he's a tramp. He's invited into a warm house. It's freezing outside. He's waiting for the weather to break. Why wouldn't he sit down? He doesn't. So Aston says, sit down, because remember, the power play of who's standing and who's sitting. Davies says, thanks. Then he looks around. Aston says, just a minute. Looks around for a chair. He sees a chair lying on its side. And he starts to get it out. And Davy says, sit down, question mark. Huh, I haven't had a good sit down. I haven't had a proper sit down. Well, I couldn't tell you. And you think, who is this? And why doesn't he just sit? Aston places the chair and says, here you are. And he still won't sit. So Davies is not going to be defeated or in any way dictated to by Aston. And that's the first thing you have to see. He is not a humble tramp. He isn't grateful. He's not going to succumb. He kind of counters him. And he starts mouthing off stuff that is totally offensive. 10 minutes off a tea break in the middle of the night in that place, and I couldn't find a seat, not one. All them Greeks had it. Poles, Greeks, blacks, the lot of them. All them aliens had it. And they had me working there. They had me working. So what you learn instantly within 30 seconds of the play is this is a character of grievance. He lumps everybody together, right? It doesn't matter if they're Greek, Polish, black, whatever nationality, he lumps everybody together as somebody alien who's out to get him, and he's not going to put up with it, right? Treating me like dirt. Aston refuses to engage with him in this, and he always does, because Aston is the opposite and doesn't bear a grudge and says, take a seat. And Davies keeps going on, and he won't. Yes, but what I got to do first, I got to loosen myself up. You see what I mean? I could have gotten done down there. And he starts to, punch them and talk about, beating people up and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you start to think, is this a madman? What is it? And then he tells this monologue about his wife, which is hilarious. He says, I'm clean, which he looks filthy. I'm clean. I keep myself up. That's why I left my wife fortnight after I married her. No, not so much as that. No more than a week. I took the lid off the saucepan. You know what was in it? A pile of her underclothing, unwashed. The pan for vegetables it was. The vegetable pan. That's when I left her, and I haven't seen her since. So he's this fabulist. Do you know what I mean? And we're going to find this with Davies the whole play. He never stops making stuff up. And you think, can you trust any of it? Can Davies succumb? Even the invitation to sit down is fraught. And so there's a mystery then about where are we and who's in the other rooms. And you remember I told you that Pinter's plays are always plays of constriction and constraint. One of the reasons I never feel they work as well in movies as they do on stage is that in film, you can always imagine what's next door, what's outside, right? The camera zooms in, and then, you don't know. You're looking at me sitting in an office right now. I could turn this around and show you the door. But basically, I could be inside, outside, whatever. In Pinter, the room, there's never anything beyond it. And in the Caretaker, the room is so full of junk, it's like a booby trap. You have to be very careful. It's very dangerous. But Aston starts to describe all the other rooms in that house, and you think, does anybody else live there? What are in the other rooms? Are they ever going to redecorate it? And then they look out the window. And you remember I told you that Pinter hated nature. Do you remember? So they look out the window, and there's this pond, and they say, is there fish in it? No, there's nothing in it. It's just an empty yard. Now, in some ways, as Laura's saying, yes, Davies is like Goldberg in The Birthday Party, except that Goldberg initially is much more mainstream, right? Goldberg has power in the beginning. He has bon ami. He's beautifully dressed. What you see with Davies is the underbelly of British society, the kind of bottom feeder who's resentful and angry and feeding off of his resentment to try and gain whatever he can get from anybody else. And Aston, now here's an odd thing. Because Aston is very quiet, very generous, he has been looked upon as a sort of Christ figure. And because he is the ultimate Good Samaritan. You never know why he takes Davies in. Davies is not kind to him. He doesn't feel sympathetic. You sort of think, who is this? But he tends to him like Christ washes the feet. He digs around. He finds him the shoes. He puts on the shoes. He really tries to be good to him. There has been much written in that regard, that there's a sort of biblical notion about him. And he definitely is deeply generous. And Davies does say, I was lucky you came in. And then he says, you're the landlord, are you? And he doesn't quite answer that, Aston. You're not really sure where he sits in the landscape here, but he does hand him this pair of shoes. And Davies gives this incredible, crazy monologue. He looks at them, you think he's going to be grateful, and then he describes going to this monastery in Luton, begging for shoes, and they won't even give him a meal. And it's another example of how the world is turned against him. And then he says, Aston says, try these. Davies says, not a bad pair of shoes. Then he wiggles his feet, and then he says, don't fit though. No, I got a very broad foot. These are too pointed. You see, they'd cripple me in a week. And suddenly it's as if he's blaming Aston for his own inability to travel, such that, and he keeps saying things like, Aston says, I'll see what I can look out for you. And Davy says, good luck. I can't go on like this, can't get about. And I'll have to be moving about, you see, try to get fixed up. Aston says, where are you going to? Oh, I got one or two things in mind. I'm waiting for the weather to break. And then there's a pause, and Aston looks at him and says, would you like to sleep here? And it's an incredible moment of amazing generosity. Davy says, here. Aston says, you can sleep here if you like. And again, in any other play, the tramp would say, oh, mister, how kind, whatever. And Davy says, here? Oh, I don't know about that. And there's a pause. And then he starts to negotiate as if he is doing Aston the favor. So watch how in Pinter, I think it's so masterful, the tables are always turned. You never know at which moment who is predator and who is prey, who has the power and who is the victim. And you can never play one thing too long, because it's always going to flip on its head, and the power person is going to end up defending, and the victim is going to end up on the attack. So he starts to negotiate. How long for? Aston says, till you get yourself fixed up. Davies finally sits. Aye, well, that. Aston says, get yourself sorted out. Davies defends himself. Oh, I'll be fixed up pretty soon now. Then there's a pause. And he says, where would I sleep? Here, says Aston, the other rooms would be no good to you. And you think, are there other rooms? Who's in the other rooms? What's happening in the other rooms? Davies spends pages in the play negotiating. He won't commit. He looks out the window. He says, what do you do for a cup of tea? Aston says, nothing. Davies says, that's a bit rough. So he's completely looking a gift horse in the mouth, which is, I find absolutely hilarious. They look out the window. He says, it looks terrible. There's not even fish there. Aston, it's very moving to me, says this thing that is such a characterizing moment. You think, why does he want to build a shed? And he says, I like ... working with my hands. And it's so moving because he doesn't look like that. He's dressed in a little pinstripe suit as if he's a librarian. He's not wearing manual labor clothes. And you think, really? And he doesn't seem to know how to do anything with his hands. He's trying to fix a plug of a toaster the whole play, and he never gets it done. And so Aston keeps trying to help him, trying to move things around. Davies keeps making more racist comments, saying, you don't share the toilet with them blacks, do you? Aston generously says they live next door, and all of that. He's helping him and helping him. And Davies keeps saying, I got to get down there. I left my papers. They prove who I am. I can't move without them papers. They tell you who I am. I'm stuck without them. And Aston says, why? Why is that? Well, you see, what it is, I changed my name. You see, years ago, I've been going around under an assumed name. It's not my real name. So there's this uneasy feeling that nobody is who they really are. And it feels, and he finally says, it was in the war, must have been, I don't know, near about 15 years ago. So it gets more and more dangerous. And then you have that classic Pinter Agatha Christie moment. So remember I told you when he was in rep, he was really good at blackouts where you'd hear things and you'd think, what was that? So in the silence in the middle of Act 1, you hear a drip. and it's the bucket. And there's obviously a leak in the roof, and this drip is happening. And you think, oh my God, this is horrifying. Maybe the whole roof is going to come down. And there's this sort of image of Noah's Ark and these two men kind of sheltering together. And suddenly you hear, don't you worry about that, mister, don't you worry about that. And the lights just black out. And when they come back up, it's morning and they've spent the night. And what is Bob asking? Didn't the racism drop away in Acts 2 and 3? That's a really interesting question. Let's look at it, Bob, when we get there, because I'm not sure that's true, because I think Mick carries forward the racism in a kind of different way from Davies, but slightly equally frightening. Anyway, the second part of Act 1, Davies wakes up terrified because he can't remember where he is or why. And then he keeps again saying that there were noises going on and it must have been them blacks outside and all of that. And then this incredibly poignant thing happens, which is that Aston starts to talk about what happened to him. And he says to the stranger he's never met, I was sitting in a cafe the other day. I happened to be sitting at the same table as this woman. Well, we started to pick up a bit of a conversation, I don't know, about her holiday it was, where she'd been. She'd been down to this coast. I can't remember where, though. Anyway, we were just sitting there having this bit of conversation. Suddenly she put her hand over to mine. She said, how would you like me to have a look at your body? Davy says, get out of it. And there's this sense of like, it's so dangerous talking to people because you never know who's going to cross the line. And what you start to find out is that something very bad has happened to Aston in that very cafe. And it's why he got taken to this mental hospital and why life has never been the same for him. So you begin to realize that Aston is somebody who's trying to put his life back together, but doesn't actually really know how to handle it, what to do, how to even make the most specific things clear, like the fixing of the what do you call it? The plug. Douglas is asking about physical traits. This, I have to say, Douglas, is not a play I have directed. I'd love to do it sometime, although not at this moment in history, because as I said, I think this isn't, given the racism and anti-Semitism in the world today, I'm not sure this is the play to do right now, although it does expose a lot. But the physical traits are really important for this reason. I would choose a Davies who has an amazing kinesthetic sense and can never be still, and an Aston who has incredible power of stillness, of self-centeredness, and a face that is able to be filled with emotion without ever betraying anything, like David Strathairn, who was my first Stanley. It's very much like the actor that you would choose to play Stanley. He's filled with history and with brokenness, but on the surface, you can't, you don't know what's going on, as opposed to Mick, who is like a tightly wound coil, enormously violent and capable of destroying anybody. Anyway, this weird moment happens at the end of Act 1, where Aston just slips out the door and says, well, I'll be seeing you then. Davy says, yes, right. And Aston goes out the door. Davies is alone. He tries the keys. He looks around. He goes to his bed. He puts on the shoes and he says, it's not a bad pair of shoes. Once he's alone, he looks at everything. He sort of checks everything out. And then suddenly this thing happens, which is just like Pinter. And Pinter played Mick, by the way, later on in The Homecoming, not in the original production, but a third character comes in, grabs him by the back of the arm, pins him to the ground. They have this incredibly violent encounter, and it ends with Mick saying, what's the game? Now, remember I told you that game playing is the thing that Pinter just loved, that everything in life is a violent game between two people. So it's a brilliant curtain line, because right away Mick takes charge physically, knows for sure that he's in on somebody who is trying to get something out of, his brother. What's the game? You go to black. When the lights come up in Act 2, you think, oh, it's Act 2. It's going to be, years down the road. Yes, by the way, it's funny, Mary Grace, that you're saying if Norman Lear was a Pinter fan, because there's some Archie Bunker. The first Pinter I did in New York, the birthday party, Jean Stapleton, who played Edith, you remember Edith Bunker, she played Meg in the birthday party, and she said that she thought Norman Lear early on in his career had known Pinter's work, the kind of mad violence of the plays, and also that the way Edith always talked in the lines never followed. It was always non sequiturs and kind of crazy mad. I mean, Jean Stapleton played Meg a little bit like Edith Bunker, I have to say, and it was genius. So that's a very excellent question. Anyway, Act 2 is about getting to know Mick. And I would just say about Mick, well, he says, well, nothing, drip of the bucket. What's your name? I don't know you. I don't know who you are. So suddenly the dynamic changes and you see what happens to Davies when he's terrified by somebody more powerful than him. But Mick also throws around every kind of slur that he possibly can, starting with, you remind me of my uncle's brother, which is basically like saying my father. I mean, who else is an uncle's brother? I mean, it could be, a different brother, but you start to think that Mick is saying, I know who you are. You're my father, or you're a father figure. Always on the move, that man, never without his passport, had an eye for the girls, very much your build, bit of an athlete. And you had a penchant for nuts, couldn't eat enough of them. And then all these things about picked it up in Hong Kong and things about, and then you think maybe he was Jewish. As a matter of fact, I called him Sid, which was, very Jewish name. It's going to come up. Goldberg says it all the time. My mother called him Sid too. It was a funny business. Your spitting image, he was, married a Chinaman. You think the father married a Chinaman and went to Jamaica. So he's got all those tropes again of who's English, what counts as English, the Jewish theme all the way through. And then he says, how do you like my room? So let us remember again that these are plays about territory, right? And that Mick immediately establishes this territory as his own. Davy says, your room? Mick says, yes. Davy says, this ain't your room. I don't know who you are. I ain't never seen you before. And Mick just keeps the power game going until he finally says, did you sleep here last night? So what you see, and finally Mick says to him, and this is why I think it's the theme of English born versus foreign is central to the whole play. Mick says to him, you a foreigner? And clearly that's the worst accusation you can make to someone. Davy says, no. Mick says, born and bred in the British Isles. And of course, that's a completely racist thing to say. There were so many Blacks and Indians who'd been born and bred in the British Isles and were more British, than recent English immigrants, and they don't count. Davy says, I was. And Mick says, what did they teach you? Pause. How did you like my bed? That's my bed. So Mick says, I belong, I'm English, I set the rules here, you're a foreigner. So again, that really nasty power dynamic of Davies as the fugitive, where every question is a threat, the resentment of that displaced white working class coming up over and over again, that theme is going to come up. And then the question is asked, well, who does London belong to? So one theme you're going to find again and again in these plays is that Pinter loves to give an almost London tube stop map monologue of, you could go to this stop and get off at this one, but then you can't get to this place. But if you got off at Aldgate and walked 2 blocks and got back on at Peckham, you might be able to get to. And it's a kind of way of, it's like a dog peeing along a path to establish your scent, your hegemony, to say, I belong here. And Mick does that to Davies all the time. But he does say, I've got the van outside. I could run you to the police station in 5 minutes. He terrorizes him. He talks all about London. And then there's a pause. And he basically sort of says, if you want to buy this place, you're welcome to. And it ends with, who do you bank with? And I think that's one of the most hilarious lines in the play. This macho guy is sitting there with this vagrant, and he looks at him and says, who do you bank with? Pause. Who do you bank with? And then suddenly Aston comes back in. And what's brilliant is, again, the leap of faith. Mick doesn't say, why did you let this tramp into our house? There's just silence. Until finally he says to his brother, you still got that leak? Aston says, yes, it's coming from the roof. From the roof, eh? Yes, I'll have to tar it over. And you sort of think, well, what's the relationship of these brothers? Again, Aston is totally kind. He brings him the bag, this bag, and it turns out it isn't even the right bag, but it's such a kind thing to do. And then you get this wonderful vaudeville thing. So right in the middle of Act 2, you get a thing with, here you are, says Aston. Mick grabs the bag. Aston takes it. Mick grabs it. Davies reaches for it. Aston takes it. Mick reaches for it. Aston gives it to Davies. Mick grabs it. Pause. And then the whole Lotsie starts again. It's absolutely hilarious. It's like a kind of crazy clown routine. You think, why is this going on? Because it turns out after all of that Lotsie, that Aston just gives it to Mick, Mick gives it to Davies, and Mick gives it up and leaves, and Davies says, that's not my bag anyway. So that question about territory, belonging, how do you identify somebody, keeps staying in the air right through the end of this act. And now you think, okay, what is Davies going to do to survive? Because Aston and Mick are on sort of opposite sides of the divide. And Davies starts to realize that he can play one off the other. Aston offers him this very generous thing. He says, you could be caretaker here if you like. Davies says, what? Aston says, you could look after the place if you liked. You know, the stairs and the landing, the front steps, keep an eye on it, polish the bells. He says, bells? What is he talking about? I'll be fixing a few down by the front door, brass. And Davies thinks, caretaking. So it introduces this incredible question. What does it mean to take care? What human being takes care of another human being? Is it a brother who looks after his brother? Is it a religious thing to care for someone? Is it a job like being the landlord, the concierge, and you take care of the property? And Davies doesn't know. He says, well, I never done caretaking before, you know. I mean to say, what I mean to say is I never been a caretaker before. And what you realize is it's true. He has no understanding of how to look after, how to be with someone, how to deal with it. So what does he do? Instead of saying, thank you, what a lovely offer, I'll try and learn, he says, he starts to negotiate. He says, well, you know, I mean, I'd have to, well, you'd see, I'd need to, well, what I'm getting at, what sort of jobs? Well, I'd need a broom and I'd need implements, you see, I'd need a few good implements. And Davies even gives him Aston gives him a white overall and says, you could wear this. And so it's all about, can I dress up? Can I perform as a caretaker? Can I start to be a caretaker? Maybe that would save me. Lights go to black, and in the blackout, right, in the darkness, Davies is terrified. He comes in, he lights a match, he loses a match, and suddenly you hear one of my favorite sound directions in all of Pinter, the Electrolux goes off. This was a relatively new thing in 1950s England, and it's incredibly loud. So imagine sitting in a dark room, and suddenly you hear the vacuum cleaner, unbelievably loud, going off. And, you know, the audience just jumps out of their skin, and you think, what's going on? And then Mick just says, I was just doing some spring cleaning. You think, oh, okay. But the violence that Mick has established never goes away. And those blackouts, those violent blackouts in the middle of the scene tell you, you know, to watch out because something even worse is going to happen. So before I get into just the end of Act 2 and the situation with Aston and the mental hospital, let's take our 5 here, if you would. It's 1:50, so why don't we come back at 1:55? Okay. Great. So somebody's asking about the sign behind me, and I'm sitting in a professor's office at University of Utah. This is not my office. He has fabulous books, but I've been here giving another class. I'm actually going to have to end our class a little early because I have to get on a flight to get back to San Francisco, but I'll find out about that. But I wanted to answer something Susan asked, and then and then just finish up on the Caretaker, which is she's saying that it's really hard. She's having trouble reading these plays. There are no set descriptions or character descriptions. How do you analyze them? And I want to say this to you as you keep going with Pinter. I would really, really urge you to read the plays out loud. They are absolutely meant to be played. He didn't write them as literature, although they are great literature, and they are, I think, completely timeless and poetic and hilarious, but they are often hard to understand. So I would think about these things. What is each character trying to do to the other characters? Sometimes it feels like they're saying complete non sequiturs, that it doesn't add up, that they're saying things that you think, I don't even understand what this monologue is about. So you have to, instead of thinking, what is it about? You have to try and think, why is this person talking this way? Is he terrified? Is he trying to gain dominance? Is he trying to persuade? Is he trying to lie? Is he trying to seduce? What is the action? Because Pinter is always completely active. And when you direct the plays, you have to think all the time, what is the action behind this scene? You can't think philosophy or theory, because as an actor, you can't act a theory. You have to do something. You have to walk into a room and you have to do something to somebody else. So, for example, at the moment where we just stopped, Mick says to Davies, look, I got a proposition to make to you. I'm thinking of taking over the running. I think it could be run a bit more efficiently. I got a plans. He eyes Davies. How would you like to stay on here as caretaker? Now, let us remember that his brother Aston has said the same thing, right? Aston has said, how would you like to stay? How would you like to be caretaker? And when Aston says it, what is the action? Well, you could say the action is to be generous, to look after someone, to cure a problem, to offer solace. But when Mick says, how would you like to be caretaker? It's a threat. It's a very different and much less generous, I would say, offer. It's a kind of, can you make a commitment? Do you know how to do this? This might be the way I out you as someone who doesn't really know what he's doing. And Davies again says, what? Well, wait a minute, says Davies defensively. I never done no caretaking before, And so Davies really gets defensive about it. And so Aston kind of wins the point and tells him to think about it, and he leaves. And then Aston comes back and gives one of the most famous monologues in Pinter. This is the last long speech at the end of Act 2. Where Aston says, there's a cafe just along the road. I used to go there quite a bit. Oh, years ago now, but I stopped. And it's one of the most confessional monologues in Pinter. Pinter doesn't do confession very often. So I sometimes think this is like what Stanley might have said in The Birthday Party years later, after he'd been taken away and to Monty and broken down. How would he have described it? And one of the things you learn in the monologue is he's sort of a resistor. He's just trying to talk to somebody in this cafe, and somebody turns him in because he could see things so clearly and says he's having hallucinations, and they send him to this hospital. This lie went around and in that cafe, and he says, I couldn't understand it. And one day they took me to a hospital right outside London. They got me there. I didn't want to go. So this is just like Stanley. Anyway, I tried to get out. So he tries to resist quite a few times, but it wasn't very easy. They asked me questions in there. They got me in and asked me all sorts of questions. Well, I told them when they wanted to know what my thoughts were. And then one day this doctor, I suppose, the head one, he was quite a man of distinction, although I wasn't so sure about that. He called me in and he said, we're going to do something to your brain. And it's so frightening to realize that this man's mind, like Stanley with Goldberg and McCann, is going to be colonized for no discernible reason. And Aston is on the ball enough to know that he's underage and they can't do it to him without writing his mother. And he writes to his mother, and it's so heartbreaking. And then he says, but she signed their form, you see, giving them permission. I know that because he showed me her signature when I brought it up. Now, either they forged the signature or his mother really turned him in. And so he tries to break out and saw his way through, and he can't. And so he has the shock therapy. And it's so utterly heartbreaking because you realize that he'll never be the same, and he knows it. that all his thoughts are scrambled, that he can't think straight anymore, and that he should have died. But he has survived amazingly all this time. And sort of wondering what he should do next and how he's going to kind of live with his life, and is anyone going to look after him? And so he says, that's when I lived with my mother and my brother. He was younger than me, and I laid everything out in order in my room, all the things I knew were mine, but I didn't die. The thing is, I should have been dead. I should have died. Anyway, I feel much better now, but I don't talk to people now. I steer clear of places like that cafe. I never go in them now. I don't talk to anyone like that. So he does talk to Davies, but no one like that. I've often thought of going back and trying to find the man who did that to me, but I want to do something first. I want to build that shed out in the garden. So every character in this play has something they long to do, to be. Davies needs to get his papers, to find out who he is, to go to Sidcup. Aston needs to build that shed, to work with his hands, to prove, that he could maybe be somebody in his life. And I think that's something Pinter deeply understood. So in a way, although the plays seem so baroque and strange, they're really just about the basic question that you have to ask about existence. Why do we get up in the morning? What do we long for? What makes people go on? What do they care about? What makes somebody resilient enough to go through incredible destruction and beating and war and whatever, and still want to live a life and have a life? And that's kind of what the third act of this play is about. So these endless illusions. Davies keeps saying, I've been offered a job, things are going to happen to me, don't take me for granted. Davies starts talking and gives a long monologue, and then realizes that Aston isn't even listening. Mick starts to describe the amazing way he could decorate the house with teal and copper plates and all this, elegant kind of designer talk. And it's all a complete delusion. So the scales keep being tipped 2 against 1, ever-changing configurations. But there is an amazing moment where Aston comes back after Mick's long monologue, and the brothers have a little shared smile. And there's something kind of wonderful about that. And you realize that no matter what, brothers are brothers. And that even though they sort of have nothing in common, and that they probably, Mick and Aston aren't going to survive together easily as brothers, but that the sibling bond is stronger than the bond of the stranger, and that Davies, in a final reversal, is going to have to get exiled. So that's the end of the play. And Aston first just says, comes in and says, I can't sleep and you're making noises. And Davies says, what do you want me to do? Stop breathing. I'm an old man and it's too cold and I don't want the window open, and all of this. And then he starts, and this is why, to the question, does it get less racist or less whatever in the play? The thing I think Pinter understands is the way people use other people's disabilities or entrapments or social inferiority or condition in life against them when they are weak themselves. So Davies says a really awful thing, I think, horrifying to Aston. He says, you want me to do all the dirty work all up and down them stairs just so I can sleep in this lousy, filthy hole every night? Not me, boy. Not for you, boy. You don't know what you're doing half the time. You're up the creek. You're half off. You can tell it by looking at you. Whoever saw you slip me a few bob, treating me like a bloody animal? I never been in a nut house. I think it's one of the most cruel things in the play, but it comes from a position of incredible weakness to say to somebody else, which is, if you read Streetcar Named Desire, right? Stanley is going to say the same thing to Blanche. Are you crazy? I've never been crazy. You think I'm weak? You're the crazy one. And really what Pinter understands is the way that cruelty works, that people use anything they can use in order to put somebody else in their place when they're scared that they're going to be the one. And so finally Aston says, and I think in a master of understatement that has the audience screaming with laughter, I think it's about time you found somewhere else. I don't think we're hitting it off. And you think that's a kind of understatement of all time. It's been so violent and so crazy. I don't think we're hitting it off. And suddenly Davies is trapped by the guy he's just called crazy. Find somewhere else. Yes. Me? You're talking to me? Not me, man. You. What? You better find somewhere else. Aston says, I live here. You don't. Don't I? Well, I live here. I've been offered a job here. Aston very calmly says, yes, well, I don't think you're really suitable. Not suitable. I can tell you there's someone I think's unsuitable. And I'll tell you, I'm staying on here as caretaker. Get it? Your brother. He's told me, see, he's told me the job is mine. So that's where I am. I'm going to be his caretaker. And Aston's very generous, says, I'll give you a few bob. You can get down to Sidcup. But basically, in the end, Mick and Aston are together and they kind of collude against Davies. Mick looks at Davies. Davies tries to drive a wedge and says to Mick, your brother's nutty. He'll tell you anything out of spite. He's nutty. He's halfway gone. It was him who told you. And Mick walks to him with amazing threat and says, what did you call my brother? When? He's what? Now get this straight. Nutty? Who's nutty? There's a long pause. Then he says, did you call my brother nutty? My brother? That's a bit of an impertinent thing to say, isn't it? Davies says, but he says so himself. And of course, it's true. He has said so himself. But Davies has just gone one step too far. So when a door bangs and Aston comes in, the stage directions say he closes the door, moves into the room and faces Mick. They look at each other. Both are smiling faintly. And you think, that's the end of Davies. And so Davies gets, excised. And the last thing is just him rabbiting on. Aston turns and looks out the window and Davies says, what am I going to do? Pause. What shall I do? Pause. Where am I going to go? Pause. If you want me to go, I'll go. You just say the word. Pause. So think about, remember we talked about silence as being either weakness or power. In this case, silence is Aston's power. He does not answer. He does not show his face. He faces the window. He lets Davies go on and he says nothing. I'll tell you what, though, them shoes you give me, they're working out all right. They're all right. Maybe I could get down, ... Aston remains still, his back to him at the window. And the last thing Davies says is, listen, if I got down, if I was to get my papers, would you if I got down and got my, and there's a long silence and then it goes to black. So it's this sort of chilling thing. And again, that's where the seesaw has tipped at the moment that the play ends. Will it reverse again? Maybe. Did Davies go too far? Are the father's days numbered? Does he have to be expelled? Maybe. But the thing to watch are the sort of fascinating dynamics of power. And I would say this, I know it sounds ridiculous, of love. So you're going to read The Homecoming for next week. And when Pinter was asked, what is the play about? He said, it's about the love that family members feel for each other. Now, you read the play and you think, love? It's totally violent. It's totally hilarious. It's about these brothers who, decimate each other. And it's about a mother who's died and they all want to screw the one woman standing. And the big question about the play is Ruth at the end of the play a victim or yes, I love what Mary Grace did. It's so brilliant. The man without a shoe gets the boot. That's a beautiful line. Thank you. And I mean, think there are a couple of things I just want you to think when you read The Homecoming. And as I said, you can watch it on YouTube if you really want to watch it, but do read it and read it out loud. Lenny's monologues. Lenny is the pimp. He pimps out women. He's the kind of slick Jewish brother. He has a brother named Joey, who's a boxer, who has been hit on the head one time too many and is not quite all there. So again, think about that beautiful broken Stanley, the beautiful broken Aston, this theme in Pinter of people who are innocent or artists or non-defensive who get their minds broken by society. Think about poor Joey and how all he wants is the love of a mother and what happens to a motherless child. Think about, Mac the father, who is Lear, who is terrified of getting displaced, except he's getting displaced by sons instead of daughters. It's a very King Lear sort of story. Think about his brother Sam, the elegant one, the truth teller, who was always in love with Mac's wife. So think about how families work, and that no matter how vicious they are to each other, there is also sort of enormous love and comedy kind of hovering in the background. I did do the homecoming at ACT with Renee Augustin and Anthony Fusco and some really wonderful actors. So next week I'll have another PowerPoint for you and show you how the design process worked on that particular play and how the casting works between those brothers. But think about how the homecoming moves forward from the Caretaker, both in terms of Pinter getting more and more adept at his craft, so more characters on stage, more complicated dramaturgy, but less melodrama, less obvious, blackouts in the middle of lines, as he becomes more seemingly naturalistic, but more in charge, I think, of the arc of his characters and of his craft. Okay, so unless there's anything else you're burning to ask today, I'm going to finish there. I'll give you a little extra time on the homecoming because I have so many images to show you next week. But that's where we are. Are we good, everybody? Okay. Okay, thank you. I've loved bumping into some of you at the theater in San Francisco, so that's been really fun. So thank you for that, and I will see you next Tuesday for the homecoming. Okay, thanks, Alfred.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Professor, and thank you, students, for joining us. We'll see you all next time.